Nobody in Merrill County, Iowa thought much of it at first. 13-year-old Ivy Callahan sitting in her wheelchair at the edge of the hay yard most afternoons that June. A clipboard balanced on her lap, staring up at the old dairy barn the way other kids her age stared at their phones. Ivy had used a wheelchair since birth, born with a form of spina bifida that had never once, in her own mind, kept her from noticing things other people walked right past. She wasn't drawing the barn. She was mapping it quietly in pencil, marking the exact location and length of every crack she could see in the old fieldstone foundation and weathered siding, and returning to the same 6 or 7 vantage points day after day to check whether anything had changed. Her family assumed it was a summer art project, or maybe just something to occupy her while her older brothers worked the fields she couldn't easily reach in her chair. Nobody in the family, and certainly nobody among the neighbors who occasionally saw her out there through binocular-sharp midsummer light, guessed that Ivy's quiet, repetitive observations were slowly building the only accurate record anyone in Merrill County had of a 100-year-old barn that was failing, one crack at a time, in a way no one standing and moving quickly through it would ever have noticed. If stories about quiet attention, resilience, and the surprising value of seeing the world from a different vantage point matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Ivy's. Now let's find out what Ivy was really tracking on that old barn, and why it mattered more than anyone in her family understood until the snow came. Merrill County sits in the rolling farmland of central Iowa, black soil country given over almost entirely to corn, soybeans, and the kind of dairy operations that had gotten scarcer every decade as smaller family farms folded into larger ones or shifted entirely to row crops. The Callahan family had milked cattle in the same weathered timber frame barn since 1911, a structure that had outlived 3 roof replacements, countless repairs, and, by the time Ivy turned 13, more structural patchwork than her father, Grant Callahan, entirely liked to think about. Ivy was the youngest of 4, with 2 older brothers who worked the row crops alongside their father and an older sister away at college. Her mother, Deborah, taught part-time at the elementary school in town and had spent 13 years advocating, patiently and relentlessly, to make sure Ivy had access to every part of farm life her body allowed, adapted where necessary, but never simply set aside. Ivy herself had a quality her physical therapist once described, only half-joking, as professionally observant, the kind of steady, patient attentiveness that came, at least in part, from a childhood spent watching the world from a fixed vantage point rather than moving quickly past it the way her brothers always seemed to. She couldn't easily navigate the barn's uneven interior in her chair, the packed dirt floor, the raised thresholds, the narrow stalls, and so, without much discussion or decision, Ivy's relationship with the barn had always been an outside one, conducted from the hay yard, the gravel drive, or the back porch, watching it the way someone watches a person they know well enough to notice small changes in mood. That particular June, Ivy had noticed something she hadn't quite articulated even to herself at first. A crack running along the barn's north foundation wall, one she was fairly sure hadn't been there, or at least hadn't been that long, the previous summer. She mentioned it to her father almost in passing, and Grant, who had 100 more immediate concerns that week involving a broken baler and a delayed hay delivery, told her it was probably just old stone settling the way old stone always did, and not to worry about it. Ivy didn't entirely let it go. It wasn't defiance. Exactly, more the same quality that made her line up her books by height or notice immediately when someone moved a chair 3 inches from where it usually sat. She started sketching the crack the following week, marking its length in pencil against the edge of a foundation stone she used as a fixed reference point, and returning to the same spot in the hay yard every few days to check it again. By early July, she'd expanded the habit into something considerably more systematic, without ever quite deciding to make it a project. She identified 6 fixed vantage points around the barn's exterior, places she could reach easily in her chair, and began sketching, from each one, the visible cracks in the foundation and lower siding, along with rough notes on the sag she could see developing along one section of the roofline above the north hay bay, a section that had, for as long as she could remember, stored the loose hay bales closest to where the family's small herd of dairy cattle sheltered during bad weather. Her brother Ross, 17 and generally kind but not especially patient with what he considered his little sister's stranger habits, found the whole thing a little odd. "You're not going to fix a 100-year-old barn with a pencil," he told her once. Not unkindly, more amused than dismissive. Ivy told him she wasn't trying to fix it. She just wanted to know if it was getting worse. Ross shrugged and went back to whatever he'd been doing, the way 17-year-old brothers generally do. Deborah noticed the sketches piling up in a folder on Ivy's dresser sometime in mid-July and, unlike her son, took a longer look. She'd learned, over 13 years of parenting Ivy, that her daughter's fixations tended to come from something real, even when the exact shape of that something wasn't obvious right away. She sat down with the folder one evening and asked Ivy to walk her through what she'd been recording. Ivy explained, in the careful, precise way she explained most things, that the north foundation crack had grown noticeably since June, that a second, shorter crack had appeared near the barn's northwest corner in early July, and that the roofline sag above the north hay bay looked, from her usual vantage point near the old windmill base, distinctly more pronounced than it had a month earlier. Deborah mentioned it to Grant that same week, more insistently than Ivy's earlier passing comment had managed. Grant, to his credit, walked the barn's exterior himself the following weekend with real attention rather than the quick, distracted glance he usually gave it between other chores. He found the cracks Ivy had documented exactly where her sketches placed them, and, standing back at the same distance from the windmill base where his daughter did her observing, he could see, once he was actually looking for it, the faint but real sag in the roofline above the north bay that he'd apparently walked past dozens of times that summer without registering it consciously at all. Grant called Wendell Osei, a retired structural contractor who'd spent 30 years restoring old barns and farmhouses across 3 counties before retiring to a small property near town, mostly out of a habit of trusting Wendell's judgment on anything involving old timber framing. Wendell came out the following Tuesday, and Grant, feeling slightly sheepish about it, handed him Ivy's folder of dated sketches before saying much of anything himself. Wendell took the folder more seriously than Grant had entirely expected. He spent the better part of an afternoon walking the barn's exterior and interior, cross-referencing what he found against Ivy's careful, dated observations, and by the time he finished, his assessment had moved well past casual concern. The north hay bay's roof structure, he explained, was supported by an old hand-hewn beam that had likely developed a slow, hidden rot from a roof leak nobody had caught in time, weakened gradually over years in a way that wouldn't show any obvious sign from inside the barn until the beam's remaining strength dropped low enough to fail outright, usually under exactly the kind of sudden load a heavy snowfall could deliver. Wendell told Grant plainly that the barn wasn't in danger of collapsing that week, or likely that month, but that the north bay's structural margin had shrunk enough that it shouldn't be trusted to hold significant weight, human, animal, or otherwise, until proper repairs could be made. He also told Grant, with what Grant would later describe as real professional respect, that Ivy's dated sketches had given him a far clearer picture of the deterioration's timeline than he usually got from a single inspection, since most barn owners never thought to document the same cracks repeatedly over months the way she had, almost by instinct, from her fixed vantage points in the yard. Grant moved the herd's shelter arrangement that same week, keeping the cattle and the season's hay stores entirely out of the North Bay while he worked with Wendell on a repair timeline that, given the cost and the fall harvest workload, was realistically going to stretch into the following spring. The North Bay sat empty through the rest of that summer and into autumn, used for nothing but overflow equipment storage that nobody minded losing if the worst happened. Merrill County got an early, heavy snowstorm the second week of November, nearly 14 inches falling over 2 days, wet and dense in a way that piled far more weight onto roof lines than a lighter, drier snow would have. Grant and his sons cleared what roof snow they safely could from the barn's south side, where the cattle sheltered and where equipment they couldn't afford to lose still sat, but left the North Bay's roof largely untouched, since nothing valuable remained beneath it to protect. The beam gave way on the third night of the storm, a section of the North Bay's roof collapsing inward under the accumulated weight with a sound Grant described afterward as less dramatic and more simply final than he'd expected. A low, grinding groan followed by a heavy settling thud that brought the whole family out to the porch in the dark. Flashlights sweeping across a scene that could have been catastrophic and instead was, given everything Ivy had already made possible, simply a mess. No cattle were hurt. No equipment worth much was lost. The section that came down was, by design at that point, the one part of the barn nobody had been using for anything that mattered since midsummer, precisely because a 13-year-old girl with a clipboard and a fixed set of vantage points had noticed, months before anyone else, that it was quietly failing. Wendell came out the next morning to assess the damage properly, and stood for a long while at the edge of the collapsed section with Grant, looking at the exposed, rotted core of the old beam now visible in the wreckage. "She had this pegged back in July," Wendell said. "Most inspectors don't catch that kind of hidden rot until it's already down." Grant didn't disagree. By the following spring, once the barn's north bay had been properly rebuilt with Wendell's guidance, Ivy had already started a new folder, this time documenting the condition of the equipment shed and the old corn crib, working her way methodically around the property's older structures from whatever vantage points her chair could comfortably reach. Deborah framed one of Ivy's original dated sketches, the north foundation crack, precisely measured in pencil against its stone reference point, and hung it in the kitchen, not as decoration exactly, but as a kind of quiet family record of the summer a 13-year-old girl noticed something everyone else had simply walked past. Ivy never made much of what happened. When people asked how she'd known to keep watching that crack, she usually gave some version of the same answer. She hadn't known it would matter. She just liked knowing whether something had changed since the last time she looked, and it turned out that kind of steady, patient watching, conducted from the same handful of fixed points all summer long, saw things that people moving quickly past the barn every day in every direction simply never had reason to notice. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from being still in the same place long enough to watch something change slowly, a clarity the rest of the world often overlooks because it assumes movement and coverage matter more than patience ever could. Ivy Callahan never set out to save her family's cattle or predict a roof collapse months in advance. She simply couldn't stop herself from checking whether a crack looked the same as it had the last time she looked at it, and in refusing to let that small, careful habit go, she saw a 100-year-old barn failing in exactly the place, and exactly the way that mattered most.